Hey everyone, so what we're going to be going over today are the answers to our 4-5 review guide. So what this review guide looks like is really similar to what your quiz is going to look like. So let's go ahead and start. All right, the first thing that I want you guys to recognize here are the questions that are on the side. They're here to help you and they will be on the quiz. So let's go ahead and answer some of these questions. First one, we want to figure out what the amplitude is. Well, notice here how we have a negative cosine. It's implied to be -1 cosine. So we can imply that the amplitude must be 1, specifically +1. I'm going to write something underneath here. We're going to say that there must be a reflection because of this -1s. We're going to say there must be a reflection. Specifically, it's going to be across the midline. So we should probably figure out what the midline is next. All right, so the next thing that I see is this +2. This has everything to do with the vertical shift. The vertical shift is basically saying that we need to move our function up 2, and in essence, we need to have a new midline. Our new midline is going to be the line y is equal to 2. So I'm going to start with that because it's so important. So let's start with a new midline at y is equal to 2. Very important. All right, and then let's keep answering some questions. Next one, we want to figure out what the period is. The period is always 2 pi over b. And b is always the value in front of x, which is implied here to be 1. So 2 pi over 1 is just 2 pi. The next one, the quadrant is always the period divided by 4. And so our period is 2 pi. Divide that by 4. 2 divided by 4 is a half. So pi over 2 must be our quadrants. I'd say this is the second most important piece of information in the whole graph because this is how I'm going to scale things. So go ahead and use pi over 2 to scale. Okay, so here's our scale. So at this point, we almost have everything. Let's just go and establish the phase shift last. Phase shift is always when I set the inside equal to 0. So if I set x equal to 0, I get 0. And so we can basically say there is no phase shift. So let's go ahead and graph this. This is a cosine graph. So remember, cosine starts at a maximum, specifically 1 from the midline. So I need to start at a maximum for cosine. So from the midline, I'm going to go up 1, creating an amplitude of 1. From there, I'm going to go ahead and draw some quadrant lines. My quadrant lines are going to be spread across against all of my tick marks. These tick marks are really here to help us create quadrants. Okay, so let's go ahead and complete that. Okay, so we're ready to graph. Let's go ahead and start this. Cosine starts at a maximum up here, comes down to the midline, comes down to the minimum, comes back up to the midline, back up to a max, back to the midline, and we're going to follow that pattern all throughout. Now remember, this is actually not going to be the answer quite yet because we still need to reflect. So this is not going to be our answer quite yet. I do need to fix this because we still need to reflect. So let's go ahead and do that. So once we have our generic cosine graph, the very last step we need to do is focus on this negative, the reflection. I'm going to reflect this entire graph across the midline, which means any point on the midline is not going to change. But any point that's a max or min is going to change into a minimum or change into a maximum. So if it's a max, it changes to a min. And if it's a min, it changes to a max. And we should get a graph that looks like this. And so this is the solution to our first question. Okay, so let's go ahead and start with our next question. I want you guys to fill out the amplitude, the period, the quadrant, the vertical shift, the period shift before we start. All right, so this is what we should have. Notice here for the phase shift, when you solve by setting equal to 0, we get a negative. So we need to move left pi over 2. All right, so what we're going to do is start with our most important piece of information, which, believe it or not, is our quadrant. Use your quadrants to scale the graph. Okay, so once we have our scaling, we also see the amplitude is 3. So I'm just going to say 1, 2, 3, just so we know we can go up that high, and -1, -2, -3. Okay, so let's go ahead and go on to our next most important piece of information. We went over the quadrants. The next thing is the vertical shift. That's the next most important. There is no vertical shift, so we can assume that the midline is the x-axis. Okay, so that one's done. Let's move on to another important piece of information, which is going to be the phase shift or the period shift. What we're going to do here is we need to move left pi over 2. So think about where sine should start. Sine should start at the origin, but we need to shift left pi over 2. So I'm going to shift left pi over 2 and think 2 pi over 4s is pi over 2, right? So 2/4 is a half. So I'm going to shift left pi over 2 and place my quadrant line there. And then I'm going to place my quadrant line on every tick mark throughout. So let's go ahead and do that. Okay, at this point, we're ready to graph sine. Sine starts at the origin. In this case, this is our new origin. It goes up to a maximum, but remember that our amplitude is 3. So I'm going to go up 1, 2, 3, come back down to the midline, down to a minimum, back up to the midline, back up to a maximum, back down to the midline, etc. So go ahead and continue that pattern. Okay, and so this is the 3 sine of 2x plus pi graph. So let's keep moving. Go ahead and answer the key questions for this next graph. Okay, so taking a look at the answers here, I want you guys to make sure you have the same things. The next thing I want you to do is go ahead and scale this using the quadrant. All right, so now that we have this scale, we'll go ahead and do the y-axis. I see the amplitude is 2, so maybe we make the y-axis 1, 2, -1, -2. All right, so at this point, we're ready to start. Let's go ahead and start with our second most important piece of information, which is the vertical shift. I see that I'm going down 2, so I need to establish a brand new midline at -2. And that's so super important, almost as important as scaling. All right, so the quadrant is done, the vertical shift is done. Let's go and talk about the phase shift. There is no phase shift. We don't need to worry about it, so we're ready to graph. Remember that cosine starts at a maximum. So from my midline, I need to go up an amplitude of 2. So let's go up 1, 2 to our maximum of cosine. From there, go ahead and sketch your quadrant lines to kind of remind you of what you're going to be doing each step along the way. So let's go ahead and sketch those quadrant lines, and then we can actually graph this function. I think we're ready. All right, so let's go ahead and start this. Cosine starts at a maximum, comes down to the midline. Let's sketch a little better. Down to the midline, down to a minimum, which means we need to go down another 2 to -4. Back up to the midline, back up to a max, back down, etc. So go ahead and continue to follow this pattern as follows. And our graph should look something like this. All right, let's keep moving. Go ahead and answer the questions for the next graph. Okay, so taking a look at the answers here, the first thing I want you to focus on is let's go ahead and take our quadrant, which was 2/4, which is 1/2, and use that to scale. All right, so we should have this all scaled. Notice that our amplitude is 1/2, so maybe we say this is 1/2, we say this is 1, this is -1/2, this is 1. That's really just up to your preference though. All right, so let's go ahead and focus on the next most important piece of information, which is the vertical shift. There's no vertical shift, so we can assume that our midline must be the x-axis, so that's good. Let's move on to the next piece of information, the phase shift. Okay, well, it says that we need to move right 1. Okay, so let's think about where the sine graph should start. The sine graph should start here at the origin. It says we need to move right 1. So let's do that. Let's move right 1, and once we move right 1, go ahead and sketch your very first quadrant line, and then continue that all throughout. And then we'll be pretty much good to go to graph this. So let's go ahead and sketch these, and we should be good. Let me try to do straight. Okay, all right, so let's go ahead and sketch this. We are starting, in fact, I'm just going to erase my starting point because I don't want to be confused. We're starting here at right 1. Sine starts at the midline, goes up to a maximum. Remember, I'm only allowed to go up 1/2 though, so I'm not going up very much. Goes down to the midline, down to a minimum, which is -1/2, and back up to the midline. Continue this pattern all throughout, and we should get a graph that looks something like this. Oops, I think I messed up somewhere. Let's see. You can kind of catch your own mistakes here. There we go. I didn't go to the midline. That looks better. All right, and so this right here is going to be 1/2 sine of pi x minus pi. Let's keep moving. Okay, so for these next questions, we're kind of asked to do something in reverse. We're asked to find a sine or cosine equation. So it's really up to you. So depending on how you do this, you might get a totally different answer than me. So that's totally fine. I'm just going to try to be the laziest that I can with these questions. So if I can avoid a phase shift, I'm going to avoid it because they're not easy. So let's go ahead and start with the first question, number 5a. I'm going to start by writing a sine function. The reason I'm doing that is I see it starting at the midline. In fact, for all of these, it might be helpful for us to sketch where we think the midline is. It just gives us some, some perspective. Normally sine, in fact, actually, I think that this is just legit sine. So I don't think we have to do anything weird. Sine starts in the midline, goes up to the maximum, so we're kind of good. So let's try to write a sine equation. We need to figure out first the period. Well, the period is going to be the distance from a max to a max or a min to a min. So maybe we do this. What's the distance from negative pi over 2 to 3 pi over 2? That's going to be a total of pi. You could just add those and double negative. So our period is pi, which means, let's keep going. Our amplitude is going to be the distance from the midline to a max, which looks like it's 3. 3 is equal to a in this case. So if I'm going to write a sine equation, my equation is going to look something like this. It's going to be a sine of bx plus c plus d. Okay, we also have a vertical shift. The vertical shift told me that I went up 1. So we went up 1, which means that our d value, d is going to be equal to 1. Some more information, phase shift. I'm going to claim that there is no phase shift because we didn't move left or right. And horizontal, I think we did it all. Period, amplitude, vertical, phase shift. So I think we're good. So let's just go ahead and figure out all the values we have thus far. I'm actually just going to use this whole space. So you guys can just forget about 6 for a minute. All right, we know that a, the amplitude is 3. So we'll start with a sine of bx plus c. And we know the d value is 1. So we'll say plus 1. So what we need to find is the b value. To find the b value, I know that period, which equals pi in this case, is equal to 2 pi over b. So if I try to solve this by multiplying both sides by b, I get b times pi is equal to 2 pi. Divide by pi on both sides, and we should get that b is equal to 2. So my b value is 2, so let's rewrite this. This is going to be 3 sine of b, which is 2, x, and notice there was no phase shift, so c is implied to be 0. We can just forget about c. And so our answer is going to be 3 sine of 2x plus 1. You also could do the same thing for the cosine graph. If you wanted to draw a cosine, you could say it was a cosine graph that got shifted to the right, pi over 2. But that's up to you. Okay, so for our next one, we're going to find a sine or cosine graph. The first thing we should probably establish is the midline. That's probably the most important thing that we can do. Let's go and answer some questions. We want to know what the amplitude is. Well, the amplitude is the distance from the max to a midline, which we can see that distance looks like it's probably, let's see, I went from, I don't even know what exactly this is here. 2 maybe? 3, I think it's 3. Let's see. Okay, well, I guess we just count the tick marks. That would make more sense. We can see those tick marks are 2. So let's go ahead and say the amplitude here is 2. From there, let's establish the period. The period is the distance from a max to a max or min to a min. We went from pi to 3 pi, so that distance must be 2 pi. Okay, so let's keep that going. Phase shift. Well, if we're assuming that this is, I don't know, let's assume the most convenient thing. I mean, this would be nice if it was just cosine. Cosine starts at a max, so let's say there is no phase shift. Let's assume that this is the a cosine of bx plus c plus d graph. That'd be a lot easier. All right, so let's say there is no phase shift. Let's say the cosine starts at the max. And lastly, do we have any vertical shifts? Yes, we do. We can see we went down here. This is actually down -1, -2, -3. This is y equals -3, this line. So our phase shift means we're going down 3, which means our midline should be y equals -3. Or we could say our d value is -3. All right, so then let's figure out what the b value is going to be. Remember that period is equal to 2 pi over b. And so if we solve this with 2 pi at the forefront, well, we can see, okay, 2 pi equals 2 pi over b. We can see pretty easily that b has to be 1. And so we can see that b here, b is equal to 1. So let's plug this all in. A is 2, so 2 cosine of b, which is 1, x, we don't have a c value because there's no phase shift, so we can leave c alone, plus d, which is -3. So if you did a cosine graph, this is what you should get. All right, let's move on to our last couple questions. We have one more here. Let's go ahead and start by drawing the midline. We want a cosine or sine graph. You can see that our midline is at 4. And so right away, we can see that our vertical shift is up 4, where it's at the line y equals 4, and therefore the d value must be 4 plus 4. We can see that this actually starts at the origin, so let's assume it's a sine graph because that's going to be way easier for us. We can say sine of x, a sine of bx plus c plus d, and we already know that t is 4. Let's figure out what the period is next. Period is going to be the distance from a max to a max or a min to a min. So my distance from a max to max goes from pi over 2 to 5 pi over 2, which sounds like 4 pi over 2, or we could just say 2 pi. So our period here is going to be from max to max. Mathematically, we could really just say, what's the difference between 5 pi over 2, the end point, minus the start point, pi over 2, which is 4 pi over 2, which is 2 pi. So our period is 2 pi. And remember that 2 pi, or the period, is always equal to 2 pi over b. Well, we can see right away, once again, b must be 1, just by using properties of fractions. And so b is 1. So we're kind of moving along pretty nicely here. We said that there's not going to be a phase shift because I already am starting off at the origin. And in addition to that, our amplitude, that's going to be the last thing we figure out. The amplitude is the distance from the midline. So if we drew our midline right here, it's going to be the distance from the midline to a max or min. So we can see that that distance there is 3.5 and 4.5, so it looks like our amplitude is a half. So let's plug this all in. If the amplitude is half, a equals 1/2, and so therefore our total equation will be a, which is 1/2, sine of bx, remember b was 1, so 1x, there is no c value, plus d, which is 4. And this would be an equation that you guys could come up with. All right, let's move on to our very last question. This should be kind of speed round for you guys. I'll show you the answers worked out in just a minute, but go ahead and take a look at 8 and 9, see if you can try these. Okay, so taking a look at our solutions here, the only tricky parts probably involve the phase shift. Remember that phase shift is always when I set the inside equal to 0. So if 0 equals 2x minus pi over 4, you can add pi over 4 to both sides, multiply by a half to get pi over 8 as our phase shift. Okay, so lastly, our amplitude. Notice here is positive 3. Amplitudes are not allowed to be negative. Our period is 2 pi over b, which is 3 pi. The pi's canceled, leaving us with 2 over 3. And the hardest part here, finding the phase shift. Set the inside equal to 0. So 3 pi x minus pi. I added pi to both sides and then divided by 3 pi. The pi's cancel, leaving me with 1 in the numerator and 3 in the denominator. And so the phase shift is 1/3, or we could say right 1/3. Very lastly, the vertical shift is just the number added out front, so 3. So basically, we're going up 3 for both of these. All right, that's it. If you have any questions, feel free to send me an email.